watershed. The issues and challenges we address in research really impact everyone. Better understanding of climate change, improving the water quality of Chesapeake Bay, understanding and improving coastal resilience to sea level rise, and also with our graduate students and undergraduate interns, we're educating the next generation of environmental leaders. Also, we make our data available and advise both state and federal governments on bay and environmental issues. And then our data is also used by NGOs to foster their education and advocacy programs. So today, in each of the following 3 Wednesdays, you'll hear from some of our scientists who are widely recognized as experts in their field. And although you're going to be muted, at any time you could ask a question if you don't understand something, and I'll break in and ask Cindy. But most of the questions we'll field at the end, and there'll be plenty of time for discussion. You'll get a questionnaire at the end. Karen will send it out tomorrow, as well as the tape of this talk, and then you could send individual questions to Cindy then as well. So today we're going to hear from Cindy Palinkas. She's an expert scientist on the use of living shorelines to protect coasts from erosion. Cindy grew up in Bel Air, Maryland, went to Johns Hopkins University, that other university in Maryland, and then went out west to the University of Washington in Seattle for her PhD. Cindy's really studied rivers and sediments all over the world, but recently she's focused on the role of vegetation, both marshes and living shorelines, for trapping sediment, and that's what she's going to talk about today. Recently, Cindy was a key member of our research team that looked at the effect of Conowingo Dam and how much sediments were coming over the dam and how it was impacting the lower bay. So really, we're delighted to hear from Cindy today. And Cindy, thank you very much for speaking with us. So I'm going to mute myself, and we're going to turn this over to Cindy.
All right, thank you, Mike, and thanks to all of you for connecting today. So I thought I would start with just an introduction to me and my research before we take a nosedive into living shorelines themselves. So basically what I do is I study mud. I'm interested in how sediment gets from land into adjacent waters and where it ends up over time. So when I say sediment, I'm lumping together, pun kind of intended, mud and sand. So mud is shown in this photo here. I think we all have an intuitive sense of what oopy goopy mud looks like. And sand is what we find at the beach. So those two things together comprise sediment. It often looks a lot like playing in marshes in shallow water. And so we're interested where it goes, where does it end up? How do people influence its supply via what they do on the land, like farming or putting in cover crops or something like that? And also how they manage their shorelines, and that's what we're going to talk about today. We also want to know how it interacts with plants like SAV and marshes. SAV stands for submersed aquatic vegetation, or plants that spend their whole lives underwater. Seagrasses are one kind of SAV. And if you want to learn more about that, you can tune into Lorie Staver's talk at the end of this series. So the ultimate goal of all of this is to improve coastal resiliency to environmental change, which gives us healthy bay ecosystems. So down here I have a photo of an eroding shoreline, and this is what we don't want, really. We don't want our shorelines that are just being attacked by waves and eroding and putting a lot of sediment into the water. And instead we might put in something like this, which is one of our living shoreline sites, where we have plants that are growing into the water, trapping a lot of sediment and improving the water. And what that does for us is it lets us swim in the water. So this is a photo of my nephew who loves being in the water. We want to make sure that we have nice swimmable waters. And this is a photo of me and some friends. I like to do triathlons, and for that you have to swim in the waters. So I'm very interested in having swimmable waters, and as well as having fishable waters and lots of habitat for creatures that we care about. So this is what our research looks like in the field, in the lab. These are photos of various undergraduate and graduate students that I've had over the years, and it gives you a flavor of how we actually sample these environments. So for example, these two students are in a marsh. This student is collecting grass up on the Susquehanna Flats. So the plants are in the bag here. We also take short sediment cores. So all of this brown stuff in here is mud. And there's a couple of different techniques by which we can take our cores. We can do this one where we just literally push it into the bottom and bring it up. This one in the corner here is a little bit more exciting. We attach a lawnmower head to a big tall aluminum pipe and just shake it into the sediment. Let's see, what else do we have here? We use our boats, of course. This is a photo of the Susquehanna Flats. As Mike said, I've done some work up there looking at how sediment gets to or through that area. It has a historically large and dense SAV bed, and you can see the grass right there. This is what a core looks like when we take it in the marsh. This is a photo of a student and I taking that core. You just push it into the marsh, turn it, and pull it up. And then we bring it back to the lab where this student is furiously working to try to figure out what the sediment looks like. We want to know its size. We want to know how much plant material it has, if it has nutrients like nitrogen or phosphorus attached to it. And then I have several tools that allow us to figure out how old the sediment is. And so all of that goes into figuring out some of the answers to our research questions. So one of the projects that I've been working on a lot lately is living shorelines. So first of all, what is it? So the term living shoreline is used really broadly around the world to mean very different things, all something to do with something living on a shoreline, of course. But how I'm using it today is a created marsh with or without adjacent structures, which is usually rocks, but nowadays there's been a lot of interest in using oysters as that rock material, so that's also an option. The clearest picture, I think, is this one over here, where you can see there's plants, and then right in front of those plants, there's some rocks. And the idea is that the rocks dissipate the wave energy or make it lower by the time it gets to the plants, so it doesn't rip up the plants. And then the energy is even lower by the time it actually gets to what one would consider like their property. And so why do we need them? Shoreline erosion, of course, it's happening everywhere around the world. It's especially fast in Chesapeake Bay. And it threatens inland infrastructure. Hang on. Okay, so a famous example, at least here on the US Atlantic coast, is the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. So this is a photo in the corner that I took a couple of years ago. And what happened with this lighthouse is it was originally on the shore, and then years and decades of shoreline erosion threatened its ability to stay like upright on the shore. So it had to be moved inland to where it is right now. And so that's true for really any building that we have along our coastlines. Shoreline erosion supplies sediment to adjacent waters. This could be bad for water clarity. If we're putting a lot of mud in the water, we could make it really murky, and so there's not enough light reaching plants or other organisms that need light on the bottom. It could also bury our SAV plants and or our oysters. But I have bad in quotes here because all sediment is not bad. We actually do need some sediment to get into the bay. Sediment provides nutrients to SAV and oysters and phytoplankton that live in the water. It also helps our marshes keep up with sea level rise. So we need some, but not too much. So the analogy that I make here is that it's like our personal diet. We know that if we have too much food, that's really bad for us. And it's also really bad for us if we don't have enough food. The other thing I should mention is that sediment in SAV grounds bury the seeds so that they can't be eaten by predators or ripped up by erosion. And so it's much like your garden. When you plant a garden, you plant your seeds to a specific depth. If it's not quite deep enough, it's not going to work out maybe, but if it's too deep, it also might not work out because there's not enough light. And so the same thing can happen with it getting buried by sediment. And so we know that shoreline erosion is likely to increase in the future with sea level rise. We also know that we're going to be experiencing increased amounts of storms, so lots of wave energy. And I think we can all see around us that we're going to have increased coastal development. So Chesapeake Bay shorelines, more than a third of them are classified as eroding, almost 3/4, probably more by now. These are kind of old numbers in the Maryland portion. And the vast majority of our shorelines are privately owned. And what that means is that individual property owners make decisions about how to manage their shorelines with guidance from resource managers. And so our job as scientists is to provide those managers the best science that we can to help guide those decisions. So in the past, people usually put hard structures like breakwater or riprap. So over here, I have a photo of a breakwater. It's rocks that's separated by land. So the rocks are over here, the land is over here, and in between you have water. Riprap, you have the rocks right along the shoreline, right there. Up here, I have two conceptual diagrams about how it works and why we typically think of these as bad for our ecosystem. And it really has mostly to do with reflected wave energy. So what happens, especially when you put in a bulkhead, is the waves come to that bulkhead and they just bounce right back off. And so you actually have more wave energy in the shallow water right in front of that bulkhead. And so what that's going to do is it's going to scour out the sediment that's right in front of it. And so it could actually cause this bulkhead to collapse. It also puts more sediment in the water, and it also could rip out plants. It could make the water too deep so that there's not enough light reaching the plants that are there. So all kind of things that we don't want when we're thinking about shallow water habitat for animals. There was this nice study in 2014 that looked at SAV abundance in Chesapeake subestuaries. So these are the tributaries like the Choptank, the Potomac, those sorts of rivers, in relation to riprap. So what you're looking at in the graph here is SAV abundance is on the y-axis. And the numbers, don't worry about them. We just know that more is good, less is bad, right? And the years progress along the bottom to the right. And so what the study found, it was a statistical study, and they found that at around 5% riprap, we had this difference in what happened with the SAV. And the colors here are suggestive. So if you have more than 5% riprap, you have much less SAV. You're in this bottom red line. Then if you have less than 5% riprap, you're going to be on this green line. And so that number, of course, is going to be different depending on where you are. But the idea here is more riprap, less SAV. So now what we're doing is turning towards these living shoreline approaches. These are mandated by laws in a lot of states, including Maryland and Virginia. In Maryland, the laws really started around 2003. And what living shorelines do is on the bottom of this conceptual diagram, it's kind of a continuation. Now we have in the middle, if we had a beachy kind of a shoreline, grading into a tidal wetland, so like a natural marsh kind of a situation. And then the bottom one is a living shoreline where we have intentionally planted the wetland plants. We maybe put down some oysters to help dissipate our energy, or maybe we put down some rocks. There's this kind of really large bird that's hanging out on those rocks that's telling us that we are creating more habitat by planting those marsh grasses. And now we have a nice shallow water refuge for things like fish and for SAV to grow. And so we sort of think that this is what happens, but we don't actually know like rigorously scientifically, right? Like what we've seen what happens when we put in living shorelines, and we can think of examples where it was really good for the SAV. We can think of examples where maybe it wasn't so good for the SAV, but we don't understand how and when that happened and why that happened importantly. And so that's where we come in. So what we want to do is really put some good science behind this. We've had living shorelines in and around the bay for over a decade now, almost 2 decades. So we have lots of time to see what happens when we put in a living shoreline. And so the reason that this is important, this is kind of an ugly diagram, but it is actually used in shoreline management in Virginia. VIMS is the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. And what I wanted to show you here is really just the decision tree that you would follow. So you would start right here if you wanted to think to yourself, what should I put on my shoreline? And then you'd kind of funnel through all of these questions. But the one I want to highlight is there's this step down here where you have to ask, do you have SAV or mangroves, which is what you would have in warmer weather? And if you do, you have an ecological conflict and you have to seek regulatory advice. And so what this does is that it inserts an extra step, and we have to do this in Maryland too. And so this could discourage people from putting in living shorelines where it might otherwise be just fine. And so this is sort of the do no harm kind of thing, right? When you don't really understand where you could be doing some harm, you want to take the extra caution. But what we want to do is come in and look at what happens when we have the living shorelines and say, well, can we insert some nuances in here to make it a little bit clearer to individual property owners when and where a living shoreline might actually be just fine for their properties. So this is research that I've done with Lorie Staver. Her picture is over here. She's going to talk to you later on in this series. And the other photo is of Miles Bolton. He's my master's student, and some of this work is part of his master's thesis. So our main questions are listed here. Today, we're only going to be talking about the top 2. We want to talk about, do living shorelines work? Do they reduce erosion? And if they don't, like, we're not really interested in any of the rest of the questions, right? Because it's not going to be useful for what we want them to do. The second question is, does SAV disappear after living shorelines are installed? This was sort of the prevailing thought when we came into this research. So we wanted to find out, is this actually a thing? And then we want to move on to other questions, understanding the why. So are ecological processes in created marshes similar to natural marshes, especially with protecting our coastlines and being resilient to environmental change? And if they are, that's great, because we have a lot of tools already developed for natural marshes that will give us a step up in moving forward with living shoreline installations. And if they don't, we need to understand why they don't and what modifications need to be made so that we can then use them to make good predictions about what we would expect to happen. And then we want to know how things change over the lifetime of the created marshes. We have some evidence that things the first couple of years are a little bit different than once they kind of really get going and are able to start doing all of the things that marshes do, like trap sediments and provide habitat. So this is not just a regulatory issue. It's not just a, like, if I own waterfront property, I care. Everyone should care, of course. This is a key component of a new research coordination network that's funded by the National Science Foundation. It's part of their Coastlines and People program. It's led by UMCs and Ming Lee in particular. And the goal is to understand and integrate the impact of environmental change on coastal dynamics and communities that are inherently linked. And we need to understand that linkage and work together to have sustainable coasts going forward into the future. And so the funding for this work comes from the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, the Chesapeake Bay Trust, the Grace B. Kerr Fund, and also, hopefully, it's pending, the U.S. Coastal Research Program. And then we also have management partners in the Maryland Department of the Environment and Shore Rivers. Shore Rivers is a nonprofit organization that helps us connect with individual property owners. And environmental concern has helped us out a lot with choosing our sites and interacting with property owners. So our study sites are around the Chesapeake Bay, really close to where at least I am now. So the boxes are highlighted region. The zoom out is over here. So just for reference, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge comes in at the top here. This is Ken Island. And these dots down here are all around St. Michael's. This dot is the Maritime Museum, if any of you are familiar with that. So the ones that are solid blue dots are the ones that we started with. These are living shorelines that are around 10 years old. And then to that sample set, we've added a few that are around 3 years old. And then we have the brown dots are natural shorelines. So nothing was done to them at all. So we can compare what happens if you do nothing versus what happens if you put in a living shoreline. And so half of our 10-year-old sites had SAV before they went in and half did not, so we could see what happened. And then as we're getting funding to do more and more work, we're kind of strategically putting our new sites near those ones so that we have similar physical settings for all of our sites. And this summer, we're going to add 3 sites with Maryland Department of Natural Resources that haven't gone in yet. So we're going to go in and characterize the site, what does it look like before anything is done, and then come back and hopefully monitor for a couple more years after they go in to see what happens. And so what we do is we look at the plants. This is Ashley Hollins literally counting the stems of plants that are in the quadrat. This is Lorie Staver in the distance here, running a transect line through the vegetation. And we take these long cores right in front of them to see how it modifies the water. And this is what one of those cores looks like when you take it back to the lab, split it, and open it up on the table, kind of like a patient, like a doctor. Okay, so the first question, do living shorelines work? Do they actually reduce erosion? And so the way we get at this is we use GIS, which is a mapping application, and we want to compare the shoreline erosion rates historically versus now. So historically, we have data from the Maryland Geological Survey, which you can find online at this website down here if you want, along with a treasure trove of other information. So I would encourage you to go there and just poke around and see what you can find. But they did surveys in 1942 and 1994. And so we're looking at what happened between those 2 dates. And then the current, we have aerial photos from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science in 2003, before any of our sites went in, and 2017, which is when we did our field survey. And I want to point out this Google Earth image. It shows where some of our sites are. So these 2 black dots are the natural shorelines, and they're paired up with these yellow dots, which is our living shorelines. But what I like about this is that it shows you what happens when these living shorelines go in, by and large. So the old shoreline, this one up here is in the process of going in, and the one further down has already gone in. So the old shoreline is right around here. And then what happens is typically the shoreline is built out. There's a layer of sand put down, which you can see here. And then the marsh plants are planted in that sand. And this right here is the sediment containment fence. So what you can see is that typically the shoreline is built outward when a living shoreline is put in. And in fact, that's what we see in our data. So I'm going to walk you through these two plots, but the punchline is up here if you want just the punchline. So what we're looking at in these plots are shoreline change rates at the natural shorelines on the left and the living shorelines on the right. If the number is negative in terms of the shoreline change, your decoder ring is down here. Negative change equals erosion. So the shoreline is moving landward. So you would observe that as a property owner as a loss of property. If it's positive, if we're up at the top of the plot, it means we've had accretion or the shoreline has moved seaward, or you would observe that as a property owner as a gain in property. And then on each of them, we have on the left the historical rates and on the right the current rates, and the boxes show you the range of rates that we have at all of our sites. And then the average are the bolded numbers here. So what this tells us is that at our natural shorelines, we have historical erosion rates that are around minus 0.02 meters per year. The number is not necessarily that important. The current rate is actually a little bit higher than that on average. It's not statistically significant, but it's very suggestive that our erosion rates actually increase at our natural shorelines. At our living shorelines, if we look at the historical rates, the number here is actually bigger. So what that tells us is that the erosion rates at the sites that have living shorelines were historically higher. And that's probably why there's a living shoreline there, right? If your shoreline isn't eroding all that much, maybe you don't need to put in a living shoreline. And then if we look here on the left at what the erosion rates are right now, they're actually positive, which means a net gain in property or accretion. Okay, so the second question, does the SAV disappear after living shorelines are installed? And the way we get at this is that the Virginia Institute of Marine Science does aerial photography over the bay since 1984, over most of the bay in most of the years. It depends a little bit depending on things like funding, of course. And so what they do is they separate the bay, and the Chesapeake Bay program too has separated the bay up into these large boxes, which are called segments. And then the lines are the flight lines that they fly. And so they do that, and then they make these maps, which you can see here, which will show you how much SAV you have at your particular location. And all of that is on the web at this address here. So if you want to go and again, play around and see what you can find. But for example, if you wanted to look at this shoreline right here, in 2015, it had SAV coverage that was this blue color, which is 10 to 40% density coverage. So we can take that data and make plots like this one. So this is showing you the SAV area in the Choptank River and a snapshot of time that I arbitrarily chose the beginning date to be 1997, and then I ran it out for 20 years. So we're starting at 1997, this box here, out to 2017, this box here. And again, the numbers aren't necessarily important, just higher is more, lower is less, right? And we're looking over time. So what happens is that in 1997, we actually had fairly large amounts of SAV, and then we had a decline to 2000, a little bit of a resurgence, and then a long period of decline until it started coming back. And so the importance of this is that it reminds us that SAV come and go for a lot of reasons, mostly due to water quality, that have nothing to do with whether or not we put in a living shoreline anywhere along the coast. And so we have to have that as our background knowledge before we can start to see if there was any change with putting in a living shoreline. So this is sort of like a real quick summary of a whole bunch of data, but just to walk you through it. So it's a table. The years are starting from 1997, going down to 2017, so same snapshot in time. This is SAV in the larger area, SAV in front of our living shoreline site, and SAV in front of the nearest natural shoreline. And so the numbers are in the table for the interested, but you can also regard it just as like a heat map. So darker green means more SAV. So what we see is that at all of the places, we have lots of SAV right at the beginning. It goes away, it comes back a little bit, and then it goes away. And then maybe in the larger area, it starts to come back. So it follows that general trend that we just saw. At the site and at the natural shoreline, it does the same thing, except it doesn't seem to come back a little bit, but that's maybe not surprising since it's fairly small amounts within the larger area. And that's maybe not reflective of what's happening right in front of our site. But if we compare what's happening at the site with what is happening at a natural site, they're exactly the same. So if I didn't tell you what year a living shoreline went in at this site, you couldn't guess, or at least I couldn't guess. But I will tell you, it went in 2005. And the summary is down in this box, that there really doesn't seem to be any obvious relationship to installing the living shoreline. Oh, so there it is for you again. So, and that happens at all of our sites, natural shorelines, sites with living shorelines. It really seems like trends in the larger areas, what's driving the SAV distributions, not the installation of a living shoreline. So I'm just going to circle back to the research questions since we're about out of time, and I'm going to use my magic 8-ball because I was thinking about it earlier this week and it made me laugh. So our first question, do living shorelines work in that they reduce erosion? Signs point to yes. So we have good evidence that erosion continues at or above the historical rates at our natural shorelines, whereas at our living shoreline sites, we have accretion or a building outward of the shoreline because that's how they're installed. Moving forward, we're interested in how well those living shorelines do. Like, do they start to drown if they can't keep up with sea level rise, or are they eroding themselves? That's an area that we're looking at right now. The second question, does SAV disappear after living shorelines are installed? Very doubtful. What we see is that SAV distributions follow the trends in the larger area. And then the last two questions are different variations of ask again later that you'll get. So if you've ever like shook in that magic 8-ball and it was very frustrating that it kept telling you ask again later, I'm going to do the same because what we are interested in right now. So what we're really, and how we can apply all of this knowledge into predictions about coastal protection and resilience to environmental change. And with that, I will stop talking and take any questions that any of you may have.
That was great, Cindy. Thank you very much. While people think of some questions, I've got a couple. So, you know, when do you think that you'll be able to tell DNR that they don't have to make property owners do a SAV survey if they want to put a living shoreline in, you know, 1 year, 3 years, 5 years? Because, you know, I think people want to do it, but I agree it would be a deterrent, you know, and say, you know, more permits and more surveys. So do you have any idea of when you might be able to advise DNR?
Yeah, so we have been talking to DNR and also the Maryland Department of the Environment, which is the body that actually issues the permits for living shoreline installation. We have been talking to them throughout this work, so a couple times a year for the past 3 years or so, and they are very interested in all of these questions and answers. And so it's up to them, I suppose, what their timeline is for revising the current rules and regulations. But we are definitely in dialogue, and we want to make sure that any products that we produce can actually be turned into useful products that they can use in making these decisions. So we're in active dialogue all throughout, and we'll continue to do so.
Well, that's great. Okay, well now all of a sudden the questions are flying in. Let me see. Is there a correlation between recent legislation and recent SAV increases shown in your chart?
Well, I'll preface it by saying I am definitely not an SAV expert. So that is a question you should ask Lorie Staver. It is pretty clear that it varies with water clarity, how much light can get through the water. So maybe I will just stop there because I'm not an expert in that. So rather than get it wrong, ask Lorie Staver in a couple of weeks.
Okay, yeah, stay tuned for Lorie. Here's one. If there is no definitive evidence that living shorelines work, why are they recommended as best practice? Are there ancillary benefits that are proven?
They totally work. Maybe the question is more of like, why were we pushing for them so hard if we didn't have really solid science behind them? And I think it's a case of we knew they were good. We just didn't have exact numbers to show exactly how good they were. So the idea is that we know they provide habitat. We know they stop erosion. We just don't have exactly how much habitat, exactly how much erosion will it reduce.
Gotcha. Here's a question from Claire. What resources are available for property owners to convert from a bulkhead to a living shoreline?
For that, I think I would direct you to the Maryland Department of Natural Research. They have Maryland Department of Natural Resources. They have a department called Chesapeake and Coastal Services. And if you go to their website, that's pretty much what they do, is thinking about shoreline management issues. And so if you go to that website, they have a lot of information, and more importantly, they have the contact information of people who can help with those sorts of questions.
Great. Here's a question by Linda. How do geotubes compare to oyster reefs? Can geotubes be a substitute?
Maybe. I'm trying to think if anyone has actually done a direct, I don't think that anyone has done a direct comparison of those approaches, but they are both approaches taken instead of, so the interest is, instead of having stone be in front of that living shoreline, is to move to where everything is living. So using things like the geotubes or oyster reefs to provide the same benefit that the rocks do, and also give us more ecological benefits.
Gotcha. What is the purpose of the openings used in some living shorelines? I guess that would be the openings in the rocks.
Yeah, and we have one of those types in our study. One of our younger ones is like that. And generally the reason for that is to allow water to come and go. So in a place where you have maybe a little bit higher of a tide, or maybe the wind blows in a direction. So if you went to Bill's talk, you know that we have tides, and we also have, when you get the wind blowing in a certain direction up the bay, you can flood marshes for a really long time. And so the opening allows that water to come and go and flush more quickly.
Well, that's great. You know, you're going to love this question, Cindy, from Andrew. How much sediment is in the Chesapeake Bay already and presumably moves around each year versus the sediment that is added each year? And what is the impact of each of these sources of sediment on SAV? That's a great PhD project for somebody, I think.
Yes, and her name is Emily Russ.
Oh.
So sort of a joke, but not really. So my most recent PhD student, Emily Russ, that was a chapter of her PhD dissertation, is that she updated the sediment budget for the upper Chesapeake Bay, so above kind of the Bay Bridge or so. So she didn't cover the area that we're in. But yeah, I mean, there are people that do that crunch the numbers, like how much sediment is coming in from rivers, from our shorelines, and even from the ocean at the mouth of the bay. And how does that match with what's on the bottom? So yes, it would be a lot of work to figure that out. What I will say is that in the middle part of the bay, which is where I am and most of us probably are, shoreline erosion is actually the dominant source of sediment, because we have relatively small rivers in terms of how much sediment they carry. And also they actually tend to import sediment from the bay most of the time if you average over some like long time scale. So in contrast to the upper part of the bay where we have the Susquehanna River coming in that is delivering literally millions of tons of sediment every year, we just don't have that in this part of the bay. So most of the sediment comes from shoreline erosion.
Thank you. How much do you coordinate and share your research with counterparts in Virginia?
Often. There's VIMS, the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, does a lot of work on living shorelines. And so the website that I gave you has so much information, so definitely go there. And we talk to them regularly, mostly usually at conferences where we present our work and talk to each other about what we're doing. But we're also usually on various committees of various organizations together. You know, earlier this week I had a call with somebody who does very similar work in Virginia, and it was about something else. But in the course of talking during that meeting, we kind of touched base about what we were working on with living shorelines. So through more formal ways like conferences and meetings, and then also just informal interactions at various meetings that we tend to be at together.
So here's a question. Melanie lives on a high-energy coastline beach where the wave action can be very intense depending on wind direction and speed. Are living shorelines useful to address erosion issues in this type of environment, or should other alternatives be considered?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that we really want to dive into. Because the canonical wisdom right now is that if you have a lot of energy, it's not a great situation for a living shoreline because it could rip up the plants, but we don't really know a whole lot about what that means, like practically, like how much energy is too much energy, and is it really true? Maybe it could withstand it. Maybe we could just do some maintenance, right? Maybe if we just went in after a big storm or something like that and planted some plants. So we definitely want to really tackle that question very rigorously. And I forgot to mention that another benefit of putting in a living shoreline instead of something like a bulkhead or a breakwater is that marshes can self-repair. So in a storm like a hurricane, if they get damaged to an extent, of course, they can actually grow back. Whereas a bulkhead, if you damage it, then you just have to go in and fix it again yourself.
Yeah, there were several questions that you answered on wave energy. Do we see evidence of land creatures and crabfish population improvement near living shorelines?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've seen crabs when I was out there. I don't really. I'm a geologist, so when I see biology, it gets a little bit exciting. So I definitely remember when I see them. There also has been, scientific studies on the creatures that live in and around living shorelines. So yes, there has been some really nice work showing that in front of the living shoreline and also within the marsh itself, there's lots of really great habitat that is actually used by other animals and fish.
Gotcha. So person said, we talked about geotubes. What is a geotube for those of us that don't know?
Yeah. I don't, again, not an expert on geotubes, but from what I understand, they're made of some sort of textile. And what they do is they make like a matrix of this material that's natural and biodegradable, and then they stuff it with other material. And then they put it right in front of the living shoreline. And so the idea is that over time, like the frame kind of dissipates in some like really slow way that doesn't affect the ecology. And then the material inside over time kind of consolidates and stays in place.
Thanks. So here's an interesting question. What is the cost difference between a living shoreline versus riprap?
I think you'd have to ask the people that do the installation. I'm trying to think if a number pops into my head, and nothing is popping into my head immediately. So yeah, as somebody like environmental concern would know, that's literally their job, is to put it in living shorelines.
So can you still do riprap in Maryland? I know they want you to do living shorelines, but if riprap was cheaper, could people do it?
Well, cheaper isn't a good reason. So the law says that you actually have to put in a living shoreline. It's mandated by law, unless, and there's a lot of unlesses, one of which is energy, which we already talked about. SAV is an LS, is one of them. And then there's maybe a couple of others. And so in those situations, riprap may be your only alternative, but you have to go through the process and basically prove why riprap is the alternative to a living shoreline.
Gotcha. So have you done any work with wave attenuation devices?
Not personally, no, but I have friends that have.
So I'll put in my 2 cents. We have another group of people, and maybe Shannon Hood, as a plug for her next week, they're looking at the effect of oyster cages as attenuating waves and reducing shoreline erosion. And as you'll find out next week, a lot of people don't want oyster farmers in their viewscape. But if we could show that the oyster cages actually damp the waves and reduce erosion, living shoreline or not, that might be one reason you'd want people to, grow oysters in your front yard.
Mm-hmm.
What is the substrate laid under the plants in the living shoreline in your studies? Is there engineering applied to the shoreline before planting the living shoreline?
Generally, they put down some sort of a fabric, and then they fill it in with sand, and then they plant the plants in the sand. But I also sort of want to circle back to the installation cost, because living shorelines versus riprap, if you just look at the installation costs, you're not including a whole lot of things like maintenance if it gets damaged in a storm, and also all of the ecological benefits that you get with a living shoreline that you don't get with riprap.
So there's obviously some people that are very knowledgeable of this. Lucas says we Unity Landscape have built living shorelines right in the bay with direct bay fetch. And as long as projects occur on a shallow portion, i.e. right up to against the channel or deep water, are very successful. More flushing, more sunlight, all contribute to successful projects right on the bay. Costs vary based on access and other project scenarios, where veterans are usually requiring more upland work and grading, so they have a higher cost per square foot. Well, that's great. We really have a knowledgeable group of folks with us today. So I've been, somebody's pulling my leg, so we've got to cut this off, but Karen Starr is going to send you all an email, everybody that registered, and you'll see the recording. And as I mentioned before, you have the opportunity to ask Cindy some more questions. I hope to see you next week. Shannon Hood is an extension agent, and she works with oyster farmers. One of our activities is to promote oyster aquaculture, which, as I mentioned before, has a direct tie-in on shoreline protection. So Shannon's going to give you some of the latest updates on the growing oyster industry. And along with registering, you're going to get an email of where you could order some local oysters from growers. And so when you have a beverage, you could have fresh oysters that were grown, and Shannon can tell you some more about the growers. So thank you all again. Let's have a little round of applause, silence for a great talk by Cindy. I hope you and your families remain safe, and I look forward to hearing or seeing, maybe not so much, the rest of you next week. Thank you very much.